Welcome to the Church Planters Experience. If you find value in these conversations, please share them with others.
So it's great to be having a podcast with you because somebody that I know.
Sure. A little scary.
Yeah.
I might turn some questions back on you, so
I'm terrified.
I maybe shouldn't be the only one fearful right now.
No, I'm not. You have to work hard to scare me. Why did you go to Michigan?
Yeah, we went up there to a memorial service for a family friend of my wife's side. They have some adopted grandparents there that they've known for years, and they're snowbirds. They were in Florida this winter, and she passed away there, and so they had a memorial service back in southern Michigan. So we went up there for that, and also to pick up my two oldest boys and bring them back since they were with grandpas for a week. So while we were in the Netherlands.
What were you doing in the Netherlands?
Sure. So we went over there to visit two families that we've gotten to know through Strength to Strength ministry. There was one family we've been interacting with for 2 years, the Haddads, Sahar and Evian Haddad. They have 4 children, and we would have got to know them through Strength to Strength, and we began to meet with them maybe on average every other month just for connection and fellowship. Became really good friends through that. And then we decided 3 months ago, Linnell's 40th birthday is in February, to go over kind of as a birthday gift. She's always dreamed of going to the Netherlands, and going to Holland and seeing the tulips and all that. And so it was like clicked, like, hey, let's go visit the Haddads. Why not? And so we bought tickets and went. And so, we were over there at the beginning of April here. And then, but a month before we went, a lady reached out to Linnell through Strength to Strength saying, hey, I'm from the Netherlands. I've been just reading my Bible, came to Christ through that, and was reading in 1 Corinthians 11, and that says head covering. And so I went online looking for people who practice that teaching, and she said, your podcast was at the top when she Googled head covering, because we recently had a talk on Strength to Strength on the sister's side on the head covering. And she began to listen. She reached out to Linnell, seeing that she was an admin, saying, hey, do you know if anybody else over here? I'm looking for fellowship, obviously. And Linnell said, well, where are you? And she said, well, I'm here in the Netherlands, in the town of Putten. And we couldn't believe our ears, because that's the same town as the Haddads. So we had the incredible privilege of connecting these two couples. And then while we were there, actually being able to be with them. And so we ended up going, kind of with a number of different reasons, birthday gift for Linnell, and connect with the Haddads, and then now the other couple as well.
So that's kind of like a volunteer vacation, huh? I mean, that's the kind of a fad is, go have a vacation and do some volunteering while you're vacationing. So,
sure. Yeah, no, it was just to go and to take some time off, leave our children all with my wife's parents, just a couple time. It's been 7 years since we did anything like that. And then also connect with these two couples. I mean, to us, that was like the perfect vacation.
Yeah, no kidding. Didn't have to waste any time in
no
Disneyland or anything like that.
We had a great time just connecting on a spiritual level, but also talking about church planting in Netherlands and dreaming about what God might want to do there.
So what's the town of Putten like? Is that like how big is it? 100,000 people or?
No, it's smaller than that. I want to say it's probably more like 25,000 people. So it's considered a smaller city, town, in the Netherlands.
Wow.
It's actually considered a farming town. So there's a lot of fields around. So a lot of farmers kind of live in town and go out, to their farms. So it's kind of set up in that more European model like that. And it's also what's considered the Bible Belt of the Netherlands.
The Netherlands has a Bible Belt?
They have a Bible Belt. And it obviously, as you think about, it should be surprising when you think about it, that Europe was, quote, Christian, right? And that's where our roots come from, out of that part of the world. But what is there is still a quote conservative Christianity in the Bible Belt. They're quickly really losing some of these forms of Christianity, but incredibly traditional and also hyper Calvinistic, hyper Calvinistic. So Seher he's a refugee from Iraq, but Evian, the one couple there that we know quite well, she comes from this very conservative movement, or not movement, but church group, this hyper Calvinistic church. And it's basically, you get baptized as a baby, so infant baptism, which is, it's Calvinistic, right? So, Calvin, Luther, they never adopted, obviously, the adult baptism. That's why the Baptists were killed, the Anabaptists were killed by the thousands. These churches are from that.
Oh, I mean, I thought Calvinism was would have been adult baptism.
Oh no. Mm-mm.
Really?
No. The Anabaptists were the genius of that. And that's why they were killed by the thousands. For them to do adult baptism was at the crux of the issue. And that is, you're totally cutting yourself off from the quote church, which, Luther and Calvin were reforming, but kind of,
Yeah, I knew Lutherans were, they baptized babies, but I didn't realize that was a Calvinist thing.
And that didn't catch on until years later when, now it's kind of not surprising for churches to do believers or adult baptism.
Okay.
But at that time, and so she grows up in that church. And also, you don't know if you're Christian because it's so hyper Calvinist. Like, at communion time, they would have the emblems up front, and only those who are saved go up. And to be saved, you have to be ran through the gatekeepers, which are the elders, and they ask you, how do you know that you're saved? Because you have to have some kind of unique experience with God. And if they conclude that your experience was authentic, and then you're one of God's elect. You're chosen by God. And so at communion, only those who are the elect go up, and the rest aren't, and they just die and go into a Christless eternity. Like, it's a really suppressive, dark,
that is
dark group. Like, it was really just something listening to her stories and how she came out of that. So very traditionalistic. Also, pretty strong group. Instead of leave that, you're really going to get cut off.
Wow, that's fascinating. Well, we'll probably come back to some of that, but
sure.
We've known each other for so long; it's kind of hard to know where to start. But
it feels kind of weird sitting here talking to you. At the same time, we always have fun talking about all kinds of stuff when we're together. So we just forget the camera and talk.
So why? One of the things I like to talk about is why you came to State College, and what brought you here. Mm-hmm. If you had any, what was the vision? Like, why State College? Why were you interested in?
Mm-hmm. Sure.
What brought you here?
Yeah. Well, Linnell and I have always lived in the city ever since we got married. So 17 and a half years now, we lived in cities. Beginning in Altoona, we lived, a block from the 4th Avenue Mennonite Church. I remember the day we bought that house. It was before we were married, and we kind of had this vision, Linnell and I both, to live in the city, live close to the church house, and be a light there on 4th Avenue. And so that's what we did for 7 years. We were there before we moved here. And your question was what brought us to State College. So well, there's a lot of pieces to that story, but in general, it was a burning desire to live out kingdom Christianity. Be absolutely committed to the principles of the kingdom, the laws of the kingdom. Be faithful to Scripture, but yet also approach it more, not so much from a cultural Mennonite perspective, but more from a kingdom perspective of what does it look like to be a believer in the 21st century, and maybe even from the urban perspective too, of where you're interacting with a lot of different people, diverse perspectives, backgrounds. What does that look like to build a New Testament church out of that? And so that was our vision moving here. That in 20, probably a pretty crucial point for us was there was a point maybe 6 years into our time there, 5 years into the city, where now we had 2 or 3 children. The question was, do we kind of move outside the city, buy a property outside, which was kind of the prevailing thought, or do we,
This was
stick with the vision? Yeah,
while you're still in Altoona,
right? Yeah,
yeah.
Or do we stick with the vision of more urban living, which we felt called to, especially at the beginning, and so then kind of grappling with that. And then in that time, I read Finney's book. That came out in 2012 or 2013. I read that book, and it really rekindled that desire to see urban communities, urban kingdom communities, raised up, planted, started, whatever.
Did you know Finney at that time?
No, I did not.
So that book is King Jesus Claimed His Church. And you read that, had no idea who Finney was, read that book.
I knew a little bit about who he was and Follows the Way. But Follows the Way was just starting at that time. Like I think it started in 2013 or something when they're kind of formally kicked off there in Boston. But so it was, I didn't know that much about it. I just heard about the book and got it and read it, and it really rekindled that passion and that vision for kingdom communities in urban context.
Right, he really
even made an argument for that
Yeah.
of why that's biblical, and that was really.
No, you read that after you were married a couple years?
Yeah, so we were married in 2008.
So you were already kind of in the vision.
So yeah, we were 5 years into it, and that vision for city living was somewhat fading. We actually had looked at properties outside the city,
wow.
And do we? Yeah, and I said the prevailing thought was live in the city for a couple of years, and move out, and that's could be one way to work things. But we were kind of trying to figure out how do we stay here, on this little, it was a small property, or do we move out to something larger? And so that book really renewed that vision of pressing into that, pursuing that of seeing churches in urban settings, and even how that facilitates community. We can live closer together and all that.
So how did you get the book? I mean, did somebody? Do you know who gave it to you? Do you know
I think it was Joe Kurtz from Massachusetts that got it from me. Yeah.
So Joe read it and said, "Hey, you'd probably enjoy this."
Joe's a reader. He's always a couple books ahead of me. I can never catch up with him.
Interesting to know how those.
Yeah, and Joe and I have been friends since Bible school. It's over 20 years that we've been friends. I consider one of my best friends. We probably have a call, an average of the last 20 years, once a month. We would talk.
Okay.
Even though we lived 6-7 hours apart and would occasionally see each other. And so anyhow, he and I were kind of grappling with some of these same things at that time.
And Joe was at the same time thinking about what they're going to do next. And
yeah, there was definitely the stirring there for sure.
Okay. Mm-hmm. That is fascinating. Just a small book is the vision. The vision was probably more than just a. Yeah. And then, so you moved here in 2013. Did you say?
We moved here beginning of 2015. So
2015.
We're at 10 years.
And the church was 2 years old.
A year
old.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Wow. So it was kind of officially founded, spring of 2014.
And where were you on the list? Third or fourth that moved here? Fourth?
I think there was
fifth.
Yeah, fifth, something like that. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so I'm particularly interested in the first few years. You moved here to start this urban mecca, and how did that work out for you?
Yeah, well, it definitely has been 10 years of learning for sure. And some of those visions were achieved, and I would say some aren't yet. Some are still a vision, and I don't feel like we have capitulated in some of these areas where there's still that vision of seeing, particularly people who are in the kingdom of darkness come fully into the kingdom of light through baptism, and who are part of our congregation. And there's been a couple of those. But it's been hard soil here in State College for sure, and as you well know, and so we're praying that God would use us here. So I'm looking forward to the next 10 years and what that all looks like.
So when did you move here prior to that young couple that joined, or was that afterwards?
They had started attending right before that. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you were kind of very similar time.
Yeah. I mean, the church had just. I mean, the church was probably only a 6-month-old here, if that. And they met them here just at a local store, and they were attending faithfully every service. Yeah.
Okay. So we moved. I want to say 2018. So that must have been 3 years later. And they were just kind of on the way out then. So about 3.5 years.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. So there's definitely been a lot of ups and downs.
Mm-hmm.
Several families that were here when you moved here have left again.
Sure. Yeah, I guess when you think about other churches that started.
Well, I'm not thinking so much of other churches that started. I mean, that also,
Mm-hmm.
that's been in my time.
Mm-hmm.
But there were a couple families on the way out when we moved here.
Yeah, I can think of one family, but yeah.
Well, and then the young couple too. So
Sure. Yeah.
yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So the landscape has changed a little bit over the years. People have moved in and people have moved out. You have probably been the most influential person in helping us maintain the vision for having meals together.
I've been accused of that.
So explain some of your ideals behind what's the point of eating together every Sunday?
Sure. Well, the idea of church as family, to me, is such a biblical idea. That's what Jesus taught. It's those who follow me who are my brother and my sister, and not my lineage, not my blood brother, and not my mother, but those who follow me and obey my commandments. And so, the understanding of church as family is a beautiful picture, and also, and that has been, or the church as a community, a sacred community, is something that I'm passionate about. Seeing us continue to develop that and what that should look like. There's obviously, you got the Hutterites on one side, and you have maybe your mainstream Protestant possibly on the other side, who just show up for a Sunday morning, 1,000 people service. So, what does it look like to live out the kingdom of God on earth, as the church, and also the idea too of, we're to be a city on a hill, and we're supposed to be the salt of the earth, and doing that together as a body is so powerful, because I don't have what it takes to be a city on a hill. I'm just one. My family is just one. And also living in settings like this too, there's a lot of other influences, more in your urban setting potentially than more your rural setting or country settings. And so to work together closely as a church is a way that we can be faithful, as we can provoke each other to love and good works. I think it's also biblical too. It says Jesus, in Hebrew writer says, gather together, and so much more we see the day approaching. And so living together, living close together, we can be in each other's lives in just organic, regular ways, not in meeting way so much. I mean, those are important too, but it's just that, just the other evening we showed up at your house at 7:30 and didn't leave till 10:30. I mean, and that wasn't planned. It was just, you just messaged me, hey, come over, and within a couple minutes we were there, and we just hung out together. And those, we need to develop those kind of spaces. That was fun, Ian, wasn't it? When we hung out at your place the other night. Yeah. Videographer Ian there checking. Yeah, is the camera working? Good. It's recording us, whether we like it or not.
Yeah. Even if it's a third try, it still works.
Yeah. Right. So, and then of course, So those organic, informal networks, contours of the church, into the homes in a community close together is a way to be a city on a hill. You can't be a city and spread out. That's not a city. A city is the power of a city. The beauty of a city at night is all those lights together. Think of an airplane coming in the whatever city you can think of. It's just beautiful.
Right. It's not just.
And so that's the power of many things together.
So how did you get, like, did you always have that idea? Like, where did you pick up the idea? Like, where did it come?
Yeah. So I would say that vision came from our church in Altoona. Well, it began there. It began there with the Fourth Avenue Mennonite Church, which is now called Altoona Mennonite Church. So that church got planted there in 2006. I was teaching school, so I wasn't, I was somewhat involved, but some older brothers were involved and others there, several families. It was quite small at the beginning. And the vision, we bought a church house in the city. Interestingly, after we bought the church house, we were doing some renovations and discovered it was an old Mennonite church. The church before had taken that corner block, that concrete corner block that had like some writing on it, had taken concrete and just whoosh,
We'll just covered it out.
blurred out the name. And we started chipping out, and here it said First Mennonite.
Oh, wow.
And like, oh, what? This was, so part of the, conference, Allegheny Conference or something back in the day, and then went down through other churches, and we ended up with it. But yeah, so the vision, so some of us moved closer, and of course we moved right in a block away, and there was some more that kind of moved in too. So there was that general vision. I would say, it wasn't dogma at all, but a vision for that. I would say much the same way as our congregation here. It wasn't like Followers of Jesus, we've had a big dogma on community. Now, it might depend who you ask about that, but it's more the vision, and I think that's really important. Once you begin to get too legalistic, it gets really weird. But it's this vision for a city on a hill.
Right.
It's this vision for church's family, and as we cast that vision, I think we're going to always have ebbs and flows with that vision, but hopefully, it's something that carries on and will continue for years of this desire to be close together. So I would say coming out of Fourth Avenue, and then of course reading Finney's book too. He talks about that in there as well.
So when you moved here, the church was young. Did they do that? Were they already doing that?
Oh yeah, that was definitely a vision of the church when I started here. Yeah,
and it's just been at times a little bit hard to keep a hold of it.
What do you mean with that?
It's kind of ebbed and flowed a little bit here. So.
Ebbed and flowed, and welcome to life, welcome to church life. I just think that's part of it, and hopefully those who are the core group can keep casting that vision, but keep living it. I think living it in a way that's inviting, in a way that is wholesome, that is empowering, that is inspiring. That's the best way to see this community life. We could go buy a plot of ground out in some country and all build a house on it, but I've never had a lick of vision for something like that.
Wait a minute. You mean you're talking about like a community?
Yeah, you could go out
a gated community or something.
Whatever. There's some groups that have done that.
Right.
Go out to Kentucky or buy some cheap farmland and everybody have a house. Mm-hmm. But that thought has never crossed my mind.
Okay.
And when I've heard it, it's like that just sounds forced. First of all, I have no desire to go out in the country. And so if you live in more urban settings, you can naturally buy houses close together, and it's a very authentic way to live community.
So, how does that play into? If you think about getting together every Sunday to eat.
Okay, so we're back to that. So I've been skirting around that question.
Well, you've sped it out a little bit, but then and into our communities, like as a whole, like we try to live fairly close together. Was that an original vision? Like the living close together, was that original? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Like that was
absolutely
a founding vision.
Yeah.
To live close together. Mm-hmm. But then we also the desire for that has also ebbed and flowed some.
Right.
How do you feel about a new church that? Like, how important is that to churches? Like, how important is that to church life? Is it okay to live an hour apart?
Well, is that a church? So no, I'm as you know, I'm definitely not. I think it's a really bad idea to live an hour apart. So if I'm, we're helping a congregation start somewhere, somebody asks me like, "What do you think?" I would say absolutely try to live close together, but don't live on top of each other. It's actually a really bad idea.
It works in some cases. I mean, I think Greg lived on top of Wendell's.
Oh, that's true. But he did move a couple blocks away.
He did. They put a little space between them now.
Yeah. So I think, we all do need some room at times.
Yeah.
Ebbs and flows of life. There is sometimes there's those challenges where you just need a little bit of space. And when you're all living, I've had, I gave some input to a church that started here in the last couple of years. And the vision there was, hey, maybe we should buy an apartment building, all living. Mm-hmm. I said, don't do it. That's not a good idea.
Why?
Why put all the concentration of church in one building? Spread out a little bit so you can impact your neighbors, like your neighbors, like all around you. You get to impact them. We get to, we just had our neighbors in our driveway this morning. An older gentleman pulled in, just our neighbor right on the corner, and we were chatting with him for a while. He doesn't know you, but we get to know him, and so spreading out then allows you to be that salt of the earth.
But you could make a similar argument for living an hour apart. Then you would not be overlapping in everybody's fishing ponds.
Okay, so then it comes back to what is church? What is the purpose of the church? Is it just to make disciples? And then how can you make disciples if you actually aren't healthy together? Like that comes down to, even a business person knows that if his staff doesn't have a cohesive vision and can work together. Of course, we live in a world of virtual spaces. The last 5 years, an explosion of that, right? Well, the challenges of that are very apparent. Like, it's very difficult to have a cohesive vision and do well as a company scattered across. It can be done. There's got to be certain, principles applied.
So you're kind of promoting the return to office for the churches.
No more. Yeah, return to up. No more Zoom. No more Zoom, guys.
No more Zoom churches.
No more Zooming an hour.
Yeah.
And it's such a blessing. Like, it's hard. It's hard to get to know people in your church. Like, our congregation has always been, anywhere from the 6 families to 12, 13 families, right in that range. And it's in just the warp and woof of life. It can be really hard to get to know those people well. But if you live closer together, it helps increase. It's not a perfect formula,
right,
but it helps increase the opportunity of that actually happening, where you can be in each other people's lives more. Your wife just pulled in this morning maybe, I forget.
Right.
And the children were outside in the garden. We were just chatting. She was just going from one spot to another to stop by for a little bit, and we talked about you guys. We figured out you guys were out fishing on Lake Erie. You didn't tell us about that. Oh yeah, they're out fishing on Lake Erie. That's why you have a sunburn, actually.
Yeah,
because you're out there on that.
Yeah, well,
down
kind
that
of
water.
that coon going on. Well, it's really neat.
Yeah,
I mean,
and so that's just how we knew. I mean, and that's how good community just happens organically. When you begin to force it and put all kinds of structures in place to make it happen, that's when it gets weird.
Well, it can. It depends on how badly people want to get together too. I mean,
sure.
But a lot of times you're right there. What was really neat about going up, we went up fishing. We actually got Riley and Connor to go along.
Okay,
so
nice.
We had a little church conference going
Great.
there. Like some youth from Pittsburgh and some youth from here. And, But yeah, it was good time.
Sound like fun.
Didn't catch any fish,
Riley said you did.
or very little. I think three or four of us caught no fish, and the rest of us caught 1 or 2.
My goodness.
Except maybe Logan caught 4 or 5. But
Okay.
Fishing was pretty terrible.
Sure.
So, I just reminds me that we were on the way home last night about the time somebody was shooting at Joe and Mariah's house. Mm-hmm. That's wild.
That's scary. Mm-hmm.
That's wild.
Yeah,
So-
that's some of the risk. Crazy stuff can happen anywhere, but when you do live in these larger cities, those kind of things can happen, and I think we're going to see more of it. It's just more of that kind of violent behavior.
Why?
Because we're moving into a world that's increasingly broken and frustrated, and I think we're going to see more violence like that. It's inevitable.
Yeah, I haven't talked to Joe, but I wonder what the motive. I mean, like, was somebody just mad at somebody that lived there before, or were they just upset that somebody fixed up that house? So, Joe fixing up that house, kind of in the ghettos of Pittsburgh.
Sore thumb.
It was, but he's making a nice little place out of it.
Mm-hmm.
Moving his family right in there, and it takes a lot of nerve, but it just, I'm kind of like, wow. Everybody's going to hear that, and they're going to be like, "Yeah, we ain't moving in there."
Well, you just think about, hey, well, I guess we need people who are willing to take more risk like that. But what's amazing is think about the opportunity that Joe has now, potentially. It's only in problems that you can really show a different, better way. It's in difficult situations, and that's a difficult situation where you have somebody come in the middle of the night and shoot your house up, and you're in it. Thankfully, no one was hurt, but that's scary. That's quite traumatic. But how he responds to that, it just all of a sudden gives you the context for so much conversation around you with people around you. So it's definitely an opportunity for him.
So, what's your connection to Pittsburgh?
Yeah, well, back in 2020, Wendell Martin and I started to interact. Wendell was grappling with, many of the things that we did, thinking of kingdom Christianity. What does that look like? Especially, how does that look like kind of lived out in more diverse, urban settings? And then he moved here to State College for a year. Oh, and actually in our first visit, I almost forgot about this. In our first visit with Wendell's, we discovered that they had a vision for Pittsburgh. And it was right that was in 2020 and beginning of 2020. And the year before, in 2019, our family spent a month in Pittsburgh because we had our one child having appointments out there. And it was while we were there, we began to, just drive around Pittsburgh, and actually ended up almost within a stone's throw of the Pittsburgh church currently is. And it's just like, there was something that stood out about that area. Like, this would be a great place. If we were going to plant a church in Pittsburgh, we think it should be the general area. And then, lo and behold, then just 6 months later, came across Wendell's. They had a vision for Pittsburgh, kind of praying how God might lead and all that. And of course, our congregation too has a vision for sending, seeing other churches get started, particularly in urban settings. And so the conversation got started, and doors kept opening up. And they moved here for a time to be with our congregation, and then we had the privilege of sending them, and also connecting with some other families too that were interested in some type of urban church planting. So that was, that's my connection. So Wendell's not a brother, but blood brother, but definitely a brother.
So just because he's Wendell Martin, don't mean that he's related to Bryant Martin. Yeah, very good. So thinking about the church here, and you touched a little bit on our vision to start other churches. Mm-hmm. Was that always a vision for the church here?
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah, we definitely didn't want to be a big congregation, and obviously we had the dream of helping see other congregations started. We didn't really have that, fleshed out what that would look like, but that's definitely been a vision from the beginning here with the one starting.
So how's, like, I think I heard at a meeting a year ago or so that one brother had a vision for 100 churches in 10 years. Was that right?
I don't remember that.
I think it was 100 churches in 10 years.
Okay. We missed that one pretty badly.
Okay. So how well have we done?
We haven't done well. If that's the case. That was the vision. Yeah, it's interesting. I didn't remember that. I didn't know there's a vision for to see other churches started, but I never remember a vision like that. And I've always been one who said that, what dreams are we not dreaming, right?
Right.
But I might call that, an overly audacious dream, possibly.
So 100 churches in 10 years is a little bit too much.
I think so. I wouldn't even think it would be healthy. But that'd be amazing. But
yeah.
you better have quite a network of other churches to help make that happen. Yeah.
So we're about what, 12 years old here now?
Right.
Somewhere in that range. 11 years old.
11.
And that vision to help other churches start has not always been just through, not just through the official, not just through official channels, but also through other organic channels. And you're pretty involved in one of them, which is Strength to Strength.
Mm-hmm.
So how did you get involved in Strength to Strength? Like what?
Yeah. Well, so when that 5 years ago, we just passed the 5-year anniversary of Strength to Strength getting started. And that was at COVID. And that was Patrick Matthews saying, he's, isolating at home, right? You're supposed to stay, no human interaction there for the first month or two. It was pretty aggressive messaging, and everyone was trying to figure out how to be respectful of these laws. And so, Patrick Matthews started this daily 6 a.m. call. Daily. So he just got a brainstorm to do it. He said it felt like the devil was doing push-ups in his front yard, because he was away from his church community and he just needed some strength. And so he needs some community. And so that he just got a Zoom link, which Zoom was kind of becoming a household name at the time, and put out a link onto his WhatsApp group and said, join me tomorrow morning at 6 a.m. And so I joined occasionally. It wasn't daily. I wasn't there. And then get into a couple months, and Patrick Matthews is, realizing that to have somebody kind of lined up to share, like with daily, like he would actually kind of line people up. This wasn't going to be sustainable. And so he was looking for some help. And so he came after me. And I said, at that point, I was like, no, I just don't have the time. And then he gave it to Glenn Martin. Glenn Martin says he just threw it in my lap and turned around and walked away. And then Glenn calls me. He said, hey, can you help me? And at that point, I was beginning to see the opportunity that it was just kind of occurring to me. COVID was a very fascinating time. We're about 15 years kind of into, if you will, where the phone, not even that, 2010, 15 years, really.
2007.
Yeah, where the phone went from, where the internet went from, on a computer screen, into your hand and in your pocket, for better or for worse. And at that point, I was beginning to kind of see this opportunity. It might have came from a book that I had read where this guy made the case that there's been kind of 3 big movements in the world. The first one was thousands of years ago with writing, the actual, writing system, which the argument made it was the Hebrews, started that, actually writing out the writing system. And then you have the next one, he says, with the printing press, 1400s. And then after that, it's the internet. And so these are like 3 big movements, and there's a lot of things that happen in that time. A lot of the gatekeepers, of the world lose their power when these technologies happen. Right. Because all of a sudden anybody can read and write and send a letter, or anybody can, now there's hundreds of books being printed, and all of a sudden now there's the internet with all the information, for better or for worse. And so anyhow, so that was kind of something I was processing at the time, and it felt like, well, maybe there's an opportunity here for us to pull in people, from around the world and around the idea of kingdom Christianity. And so, so I jumped in with Glenn, and we made some changes to it. We went to, I think at that point, a weekly meeting. Now we're just twice a month. But that's kind of how that got started.
And it wasn't called Strength to Strength.
No, it was called Week to Week.
And that was like
week, WEEK, to week, or what whatever. I forget which way it was.
Both
there.
spellings.
It was the week idea to week,
Yeah.
And then there was I think it was John D. Martin actually gave a talk out of Psalm 84 on the idea of going from strength to strength, which is a really beautiful idea if you go look at that. This idea of going on a pilgrimage, and we're kind of sojourners here, and with God and His help, we can go from from strength to strength, greater strength. So that's how it got named. Strength. And that was even, I was somewhat involved at that point, but It was a lot of, I'd say that strength to strength was something that God was doing, that God was raising up, and some of us just happened to be in the way of it. And so it just kind of grew and took off, and all of a sudden we have hundreds of people that are listening to it, and it was no strategy of our own, other than just some work to make it happen.
So you've covered a wide variety of topics on strength to strength. Do you have is there some kind of vision statement or goal? Like what's the idea behind strength to strength?
Yeah, well, our vision statement is to inspire flourishing communities of Jesus followers around the world.
Okay.
Inspire or equip or something like that. So our focus with strength to strength is to assist the church in earnestly contending for the faith that was once for all delivered to the saints.
So you've recently kind of run a series on the historic faith or the early church writers, kind of in that genre. Like, what does that have to do with Christianity? I mean, we're Anabaptists and Mennonites. Why are you promoting that?
Well, so obviously we're in the 500th year anniversary of Anabaptism, and so it would seem, I mean, that's an incredible era to go look at and learn from and be challenged by. Is the beginning, 1525 is the Anabaptist movement. However, as we discussed that, it felt like there's a danger of just looking at the Anabaptist movement. I mean, it's only 500 years ago. It's really not that old. I grew up thinking that 500 years ago was ancient, but it's actually not. When you think about, the 2,000 years of the church and the whatever thousands of years, since the beginning of humanity, and
it's just a brand new baby.
And it is quite new. And so as we talk about that, let's actually begin back at the beginning and work our way out through, and we'll probably hit the Anabaptists here in 2025. It's gonna be towards the end till we actually get there, because we're at almost 16, 17 talks, and we're only up into 400 years, after Christ. We have a couple more talks to kind of work on that in that area yet before moving into kind of the Middle Ages. But so what was your question again?
Like, why are you concentrating on that part when they're kind of removed from us? Like, we're Anabaptists. Yeah. Like, or we're...
Well, yeah, so...
Like, our background is Anabaptism. Why are you focusing so much on the early church?
Because that is very, very important for us, that that the church in the 21st century becomes rooted in history and understands the beginning of the church, understands the first couple hundred years, what the church, how they thought and what they did, because it's it should be very informative and also very important for us to know that, because those were the people that sat at the feet of the apostles, those early church writers, those early communities. By the beginning of the first century, the 100s, by the beginning of the first century, there was small communities in every corner of the empire. Like, just 60 years after Christ, after the resurrection, after the ascension, 60 years approximately, we have a church, these little communities in every corner of the empire, and even beyond that. It's even beyond that, into the east further. And so, what the church did, and then of course you go into the 200s, into the second century and the third century, and you see Rome, kind of capitulating to Christianity, basically. Yeah. Unfortunately, and the way they influenced, the impact they made in a world that had no understanding of Christianity, is something for us to really learn and study from. But I think too, even just looking at their teaching, with at our cafe, we interact with a lot of ancient faith people, a lot of Catholics, radical Catholics, and taking them back and helping them see that the church in the first couple hundred years was a church that believed in enemy love, was a church that totally ignored, rejected the power of the empire. Like that wasn't even an idea for them to use the empire to influence Christianity. And you look at Catholicism, Orthodoxy, and of course Protestantism. That's what they, and many times that's what they do. No, not totally, but that's definitely one of the big ways, one big piece of the pie of how they change the world, how they will change the world in their mind is through the empire, through government.
Christian nationalism.
Yeah, and so I think there's just so much to draw from. And just going through this series has been incredibly powerful. There's one talk by David Anderson called "The Practical Distinctives of the Early Church." You should link it in this video. But that talk is amazing. I wish it had like 20,000 views.
Practical distinctives.
Practical distinctives of the early church.
Okay, we'll put that in the links.
And he goes through, what does a church gathering look like? What did they do in the church gathering? He looks at how they live their lives, and there's just so much to learn from that. And we live in a time too, and I think right now is a time for us to be rooted and to be embracing and understanding the teaching of the church, what is false teaching,
right,
and what is the biblical teaching, and backing it up with more than just the faith once we're all delivered to the saints, which is the New Testament, which is really important. Of course, that's what we all go back to. And any kind of teaching that goes against the teaching of the New Testament, we need to reject that. But looking at those several hundred years, you can see people living it out in ways that are so inspiring to us today, and can help us say, this is why we do this, because of the teaching of the New Testament right here. And look at the commentary of the early church. This is what they did too. And more and more people are looking for rootedness. I just had a conversation at our cafe just minutes before coming here for this interview with two Protestant guys who do student ministry, and we were talking about some of the recent findings actually by some of the big pollsters, one out of UK and one here in the US, who's saying that the interest in church, the interest in the Bible, the interest in Jesus is just trending up like big time.
It's driven by man,
and it's men. Men are leading the percentages. Young men.
That's exciting.
Yeah, and it is. We're in a very, very, very interesting time. What are we going to do? To harness that, to steward that.
Yeah.
I just think there's just so many opportunities. But one of those opportunities is not just focusing on converting souls. That's important. But seeing faithful churches raised up that are first being the church, that are being the ecclesia, being the faithful country, the church, seeing those raised up, churches that are being that patient, that non-anxious presence in communities. The little quote of what the conscience is to the body, the church should be to the world. Where we're just living out these righteous lives in front of people, where they can see us, observe us, where they can, ask those questions about us, and the first Peter 3:15 type of way of doing evangelism. But yeah, those things are to have church communities to bring people into. Of course, we need that. That's right. Like first and foremost, and then having our churches rooted in something, yes, 500 years old, that's wonderful, the Anabaptist movement, sure, Anabaptism, but those Anabaptists were anchoring themselves into a practice that had been largely lost, but they were uncovering it in the early church, in those writings. They were reading those writings in those ancient languages, in Greek and Latin, and those, they were reading that, those early church writers, and so that was giving them the confidence to step forward and say, separation of church and state, adult baptism, that was giving them that confidence to press forward, and the same should be for us today. And I think that that, and actually this guy told me, this Protestant guy he said, and it's interesting, he said how many these men are actually converting into Catholicism and Orthodoxy, which is obviously a trend that you and I are aware of as well. And, but it's too bad. Like it's, these men are being pulled into a big institution that has some good points about it, but in so many ways is no longer living according to the New Testament.
Well, the argument is so forceful because they say, well, we go back to the Protestants, Anabaptists started 500 years ago.
Right.
We go all the way back thousands of years. And I just had the kind of a fun conversation with an Orthodox background person the other day. And they said that, they're telling me about how they go back to the Orthodox, like go back to the early church fathers, they call them. And that's how they know it's true. Because the question was, how do you know it's true? Like if you just read the Bible, there's so many interpretations. There's hundreds of interpretations of the Bible. So how do you know it's true? So they go back to the early church fathers and filter it through that. And they were like, you Mennonites, you're just 500 years old. Like, how does that work? I said, well, we're actually doing that also. We're going back and we're just using the first couple hundred years. And then they were like, yeah, but you say no jewelry. Like, where do you get that? I said, well, if you just need to go back to the early church fathers, I mean, the Orthodox are not being true. No. Like they're not being true to that. They're not going back to they're not using it in that way. They're kind of doing more of this bridge thing and not actually going back and seeing what was going on in the beginning.
Right.
Because there's pretty unanimous. Yeah. Jewelry was pretty unanimous. No jewelry in the first couple centuries. So I just thought it was pretty neat how.
Yeah, those guys go back about as far as Augustine. Which is kind of their it's a trademark early church father, but to go on back beyond that, like they're not aware very much at all.
Oh, really?
Of some of the early church fathers before that, and so some of the things that were happening. So Augustine comes, I believe it's 400s. Yeah, he's in the middle of 400s. He's there, and so the church has begun to apostatize already. There's a lot of people being tied in with church and state, and he even kind of develops what people say is what Luther and Calvin built on, and that is the what we call Calvinism or faith alone. And so, but yeah, he was a genius. He was an incredible writer, and there's some of his books that I see my Catholic friends packing in, and they're reading them there at Sowers. We're having these conversations. But yeah, there's ideas. They're not. Yeah, to go back there and look at what their practical living. It's not really there. It's just more of like our church is in in succession, apostolic succession. That's what matters. It's definitely convoluted.
Well, they put a lot of emphasis on the correct theology, like whether or not the what happens in the Eucharist, like what is the process, what else is happening there.
Yeah.
That theology is definitely has its.
It gets hyper nuanced. Yeah, for sure.
Look, we need to have a proper respect for that, but we don't need to be just so. I think as Anabaptists, we've been more interested in what your theology produces than we are than what you actually believe.
Yeah, that's true.
But tell me a little bit about what the Anabaptist theology on communion has produced.
Well, I mean, I think that. So your question is on communion.
Yeah, like that's something that I don't feel like we have. Growing up, I don't remember having a lot of teaching on, other than reading some of the scriptures, and I remember it being fairly heavily emphasized that this is just a symbol of our, like, a very symbolic view of communion. But if you look at what that has produced, or how that has changed the way we live out communion, right?
Yeah, the way we practice it.
Yeah.
So ideas are consequences, right?
Right.
Yeah. Which so you would see. some of the Protestant world, and the Anabaptists, maybe you could say reacting to transubstantiation, reacting to that and going, getting pulled into the ditch of symbolic only, which is a huge loss when you lose when that physical emblem, which is a it's a sign to us, right, of a much greater spiritual reality that happens when we actually engage with that, when we do that. What is happening in the spiritual world when that is lost, and it becomes just something that we were to remember. I think that's a huge loss, and definitely is something that I think you can make the case too that not all early Anabaptist people went that direction necessarily right away.
Right.
There was some who really who taught on that. I'm forgetting his name right now, is one of those writers, but the idea of there being grace in those sacraments. It's being sacramental. It could be the word, but it's it's not being obviously taught and practiced in the sense of the Catholics, the ones they left out of.
Right.
But there's an embracing of the mystery, but of the reality of grace being there.
It seems like they moved away from, they backed away from the Catholic dogma of transubstantiation, but it if you read them, it feels like they've landed more at something like real presence, and not all the way to the other ditch. Like I think initially they seemed like they just backed up. They kind of took a couple steps back.
Sure.
And my understanding is they did have communion frequently in the beginning.
Right.
Like it was.
I mean, Sattler says that if you read some of the preamble to the Schleichheim Confession, do this often, as often as you're together. Yeah.
But they didn't live very long.
It's true. There were thousands that were killed. Yeah.
If you look at those first three, men, they I don't think any of them lived more than.
Right. Sattler within 2 years. Yeah. So, okay. So you talk about real presence. Could you unpack a little bit what you mean by that?
Well, the real presence is just the belief that what the Bible says about communion is true, that it does say that this is my body, this is my blood. So in some way, we don't know what it is, but in some way, Christ is in the blood and the wine.
In the bread and the wine.
Sorry, in the bread and the wine, like in some way.
Yeah.
Like we don't know how, and we're not trying to use all these. We don't have all the doctrines laid out on how that works.
Exactly.
But we do believe that is.
Sure. Yeah.
I just heard a really interesting teaching. I think David Berceau said that that there is, and I can't explain it in all these details because it's beyond my grade level, my pay grade. But like in an atom, there is an atom, like in a whatever that little thing is, when they're all joined together, there's like a molecule. That's what it is. It's like 80 or 90% air. And so people are saying, well, how could the blood and wine become Christ? Well, if it's 80 or 90% air, surely Christ can occupy the airspace. It wouldn't have to change anything about the.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
Like there wouldn't have to be any physical changes, and it could still.
Thank you, David. Yeah,
it could still be that way.
Yeah.
So that's.
Well, and I think some of these things are so crucial for our churches today because people are becoming more and more aware that the church in the first couple hundred years had a very what's being called a sacramental view of the Eucharist, of communion of the Eucharist and baptism. Like there is something that happens, and of course the argument, if you can be condemned by taking communion unworthily, why not be blessed by taking communion worthily? And so you begin to look at some of those teachings, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. And I think there's so much beauty there and so much power there, and I believe that we're living in a materialistic world where some of these things just seem almost crazy to the Western mind. It was just the crazy other people who thought these things. But when you begin to understand the spiritual element, the spiritual side to these things, that's where beauty is. I grew up being taught by, it's just like the kingdom. It's the kingdom of God. You cannot see it, but it's here. And Jesus says, within you. It's in your midst. It's, it's coming. It's growing. It's like, where is it? Well, it's there.
We believe that.
He have the eyes to see, will see it, right?
We believe that, and there's no
Yeah.
Government buildings and police officers around. And
Right, but it's that upside down kingdom idea. It's the right now it's the week. It's called Passion Week, or what's the other terms for it? But we're Palm Sunday. Jesus rode into Jerusalem on a donkey, upside down way, and so helping people see these spiritual realities is what Christianity is all about, and the idea that the spiritual is more real than the physical. They're way beyond. We can't even comprehend it. I can look at that coffee roasting machine right there, and it's metal. I've seen it roast coffee. I've tasted it. It tastes amazing, But it can be really hard to help people understand the kingdom of God, and that's what's so important about people living in community, living that out. That gathered assembly, not a church house, not a beautiful building, but a people. And that's what's so beautiful too about these ordinances, that has is a term that we are used to, or these sacraments, is helping your own heart and mind and others understand the spiritual significance of them. I don't know, does that make sense?
So, when you moved here, whenever 2015, was the church here practicing communion regularly?
I think we were monthly. I think we were doing it monthly, yeah. Okay.
Because when I moved here, it was monthly, and I didn't even know that. I moved here without even knowing that. Okay. I didn't realize. I was like, communion? Like, what? We're having communion this month? And then it's like, wait, next month too? Like, what's going on here?
Why we're not washing feet every time? Yeah, I'm just saying it's what you thought, maybe.
I think that question did come up at some point.
It's funny. I just had someone ask me about that. So, why you wash feet every Sunday? And what would be your response to that?
That's actually a good question. And there again, like the spiritual versus the physical. Like, I think that we do wash feet more often than most churches. 4 times a year, right? Or twice a year, or something like that.
Hopefully we're living out the spiritual.
But hopefully we're living out the spiritual and washing feet all the time. But as in serving each other. Mm-hmm. I'm a little bit careful with some of those explanations, because people use the same explanations with communion. Like, well, you can be in communion with Christ and with each other without actually taking the bread and the cup. But there is something life-giving about the bread and the cup that I think belongs central in a service, and not. And I think in our world today, we have, especially as Anabaptists, by moving to a sacramental, by moving to a symbolic view of communion, the Eucharist has lost its place as central in the service, as the sacrifice of thanksgiving, and this partaking of the life of Christ. We've lost that, right. And so we've become a service that we don't even know what we're there for.
Right.
We think we came to the service to get together and listen to a message, or sleep in church, or whatever, catch up on our rest, or like we forget that. I think we forget the importance of what Jesus said we're supposed to gather. He said, when you gather, do this in remembrance of me. He didn't say when we gather, let's study the Bible or have a Sunday school lesson, which those are good things, but that's not what he said to do.
Right.
And I think as we lose that, we lose some authenticity.
Sure. So, but my question was, how do you respond to the question of why don't you wash feet every Sunday?
Well, I don't know. I won't have a good answer for that.
Okay. Well, I think it's as simple as 1 Corinthians 11 does not include feet washing. I mean, that is the beginning of the service, right?
Right.
You know, that first part of 1 Corinthians 11. I'm going to start the last part there. I mean, it begins with the head covering and women covered, men not covered, all that, and then from there on out, then that whole rest of 1 Corinthians, except 13, is all about a church service.
So what? I guess I haven't even looked, but like, what did the early church writers write?
Yeah.
Have to say about feet washing?
Where's David Brousseau's dictionary? I'm not even sure. That would be interesting to look that up. But, I think that's one of the reasons why, we don't necessarily, when we have communion, we don't always do that, because it's not really a part of that communion.
Like, we're not actually
of the Eucharist.
We're not trying to recreate the Last Supper. What we're trying to recreate is Jesus' commandment to remember him,
right,
with the
and that's
bread
what Paul
and the grape
repeats.
juice.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, you brought it up, so you have opinion of grape juice for wine?
Well, it's all the fruit of the vine.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it is definitely an uneducated view to say that the church used grape juice at any point. I mean, they may have occasionally. Like, I could see that once or twice a year when they had fresh grapes. Sure, maybe they used grape juice. Why not? But it would have been virtually impossible to do that year round, and every time they met together.
Right.
And it would also make it unnecessary for Paul to say that some of you are drunk, and some of you haven't even eaten yet.
Right.
Like, that would make no sense if they were just drinking grape juice. Like,
right.
You don't get drunk on grape juice.
Yeah.
And I think there's also some symbolic things happening there too with the wine.
Sure.
Wine having cleansing properties, and
right.
and grape juice not. So also makes it way more sanitary for a single cup, and it also makes it. I don't know how much wine they were drinking in the early church, but if they were talking about getting drunk, I think it was maybe more than a sip. And alcohol does have really good, strong social lubrication.
Well, you have to remember though, like the Jewish people, for their Passover meal, they actually drank like 4 glasses of wine.
Wow!
Why 4? In that Seder meal, they called it, which was remembering that special Passover meal where they're remembering coming out of Egypt, and which is this time of the year right now. Many Jewish people are doing that meal, and that's how it was set up. You would drink like 4 glasses of wine in that meal.
But what was the why 4? Do you know, or do you?
Yeah, I'm not sure why that was. I mean, every part of that meal has significance, and it's amazing to look at it. Just, we're in Passover week here, and our family is actually kind of going through some of the things that happen, and just amazing. You look at that meal that the Jewish people today practice, the Orthodox Jews practice. It's like Jesus is all through that.
And they don't realize it.
Yeah. And so the fulfillment, these all are just a shadow of the monument, and that's Jesus Christ. And wine, just ties, and Jesus comes along and takes some of these things. And so, so they were used to drinking a good bit of wine.
So my observation there was maybe communion was much more social than it. Like, I grew up with communion being a very solemn, very wow.
You look at the Last Supper. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Like a very structured, very solemn meeting that was terrifying, because if you had any sin, you might get struck dead, and you'd better have been to council meeting. Like, it was only twice a year, so that way you didn't have to live on pins and needles all the time. You could just kind of have preparatory services and make sure everything was good right at the point of communion. And I think that's another consequence of irregular or taking the communion or the Eucharist away from the Sunday gathering. Is it allows people to live. I mean, of course, I'm not accusing people of doing that on purpose,
right?
But it does create these waves of,
right.
Communion. Let's be really holy for communion, and then let's really dial in and everybody get their shoes polished and their right color. Put away their dresses that don't quite meet the communion or the church standard, and then you have communion, and then that's over. Now we can get that back out. You have these waves where if it's every week, I mean, it's hard to have a waves.
Yeah.
On a weekly
basis. I think that's some of the genius of the Lord's Supper. And as you see, the early church, they were practicing that weekly. Their gatherings were not about a message so much. I'm sure there was some messages.
Yeah, there was.
But it was more about a meal together, right? And we see that beginning there in 1 Corinthians 11 right on through. So it's a meal. So it's very relational. And you asked me, earlier, was it an hour ago, 2 hours? I'm not sure what it is now even. But you asked me, why I care about a meal, and I never really answered that. But if a group, if we are to be a family, one of the huge parts of being a family is the table.
Yeah.
It's just huge. I mean, and it's human. It is human. The table is just used all through Scripture. The communion table. We even use that. We would have used that years ago in regular Mennonite church. The communion table is used, and they often have a table up front, right, with like the emblems on it.
Right.
So it was that the table idea just flows through Scripture, and so it begins with the table, in Eden, and ends with the table,
right.
The marriage supper of the Lamb. And so the new creation, the new humanity, is very relational, and food is such a part of that.
Right.
And you see Jesus ending his time on earth. Some of the last things he did. Often before a person dies, the last he said and did are significant. The last thing he does is has this Lord's Supper. And so we take that and we try to recreate that in our times of communion, where there is a meal together. I think that's important.
To actually have a social, I mean, it is a social time.
Right.
It's not just spiritual, it's also social, because we are social and spiritual beings.
Yeah.
Like I think too often churches try to separate that up. Well, this is a spiritual time, this is a social time. And put them into different compartments.
Yeah, and it's one service.
Where if you can bring them together,
yes,
then we have more of a cohesive.
Yeah, and I think there's definitely been a growth in that idea of church as family in the Anabaptist world. I think from when I was 10 years old to being 40 years old, that 30-year span in there's definitely been an understanding of a church as family. Back in way back when I was 10, the church I went to there with my parents, they might have had a fellowship meal twice a year. It wasn't not often at all. Now, there was fellowship that happened in homes. Some of that went on. A lot of that went on, I'm sure. But there's something about the whole church being together. There's this equalizing effect where you have, and that's what was so beautiful of the early church, is you had the rich eating with the poor. That is how they broke down some of those sociological lines that were just there from the world. They broke them down. It says, and the rich was giving the kiss of peace, to the poor, and they were eating together. It was so empowering. It was just a picture of the new creation right there. And so that's some of the genius of the Lord's Supper.
Right.
And the church eating together.
You were talking about earlier about they have a little table up front, the communion table up front. So I remember as a small child that after church that there would be leftover bread, and it was fun for the children. We'd go up there and we'd eat the leftover bread, because there'd be a pile of it, and then you'd get. I remember wow, that was our thing with communion. Like we could go eat that leftover bread, but we were in a communion service recently where there weren't very many people there, and the one of the leaders said, "Well, hey, cut that bread in half. Let's just bless half of it." So we're not
feeding blessed bread to people who aren't
feeding. Yeah. So the children can eat the rest of it.
Yeah.
Like, what's the point of something like that? Like that doesn't make sense to. If it's just a symbol, then why only bless half of it?
Right. Yeah, and then there's a worldview behind that's saying that.
It's just something that I didn't grow up with. I didn't grow up with that thought. That the blessed bread is only for the those that are worthy.
Yeah.
It's pretty neat. It just brought me back to when I was little. We used to run up there and eat that bread. I don't know how much damnation I ate to myself.
No.
Really, that was.
Yeah. No, I think it shows. It's just part of the consequences of understanding that there is something spiritual that is happening, and it's a way for us to help communicate that. It's part of. It's the unintended consequences of that understanding, which is good.
Yeah.
Those unintended consequences are huge in anything that you do. What are the unintended consequences? Well, and that can really help. It's not the main thing, but it's a thing.
Right.
And it helps us understand the importance of that and the seriousness of it. And there is something spiritual that is happening.
Well, back to your moving here. What did you do for a living when you moved here?
Yeah, so we moved here. I continued to work for our family business back in Hollidaysburg for the first number of months. We were along with several families from our church. We were praying about, starting a cafe, a kingdom embassy, we called it, kind of in downtown, right close to Penn State University. And so that's what I did for the first number of months, was still work for our business back there. And then in August or end of July, we came across this little cafe that was for sale. It was two Egyptian guys had moved into town a couple years before, and they leased 3 different restaurants. Wow. With some big audacious dreams of running these, making a lot of money off of the university here. And unfortunately, it was really quite. They leased it from the same company, all 3 businesses. And as I looked at it later, I felt like that leasing company should have never done that, because it was just their death knell. Why they actually did that and didn't say, no, this is a really bad idea. Anyhow, so they were doing very poorly at all 3, in 2015, weren't making their payments. And so they put one of those businesses up for sale. And we happened to look on businesses for sale on Craigslist and saw this little cafe, college town cafe, for sale in downtown. And we went down and found it and met with the owner. And within a couple of days, we owned it. And came to find out that that cafe had actually been shut down by the health department because it was so dirty. It was being ran so poorly. So that's kind of how we got our space. Getting real estate. Getting into a rentable space in downtown can be challenging, especially in those days. Now, in the last couple of years, you put all these big high rises up. Now you have a lot of new infrastructure. It's really expensive. but there's a lot more. But in those days, it was pretty difficult because it wasn't a whole lot of new stuff. And so to find a space was challenging. So by buying that business, got us into that space there.
And then you opened a cafe and made lots of money and
rolled in the dough. Yeah, right.
So how did you open a cafe with? I mean, you're working in a family business, so you're probably not. You wasn't like you were the bottom guy on the landscape crew, but it takes a lot of cash to open a cafe. Like you don't open a restaurant unless you have means. How did you open a restaurant? Like, where did you get the money?
Sure. You like asking personal questions.
Well, so my goal is to ask these questions so that other people that want to do it are not thinking, well, hey, I can go out there with,
All right. Well, if your goal is to help other people to see more cafes open, then let's talk about it. What do you want to know? Yeah. So, you're right. We didn't have just a lot of capital. We had to buy a house moving here, and housing pretty expensive. So we didn't have a lot of extra. We actually didn't have a lot of extra capital to invest in a business. But thankfully we had some, and then we had a brother who believed in the vision that gave us some capital he wanted to invest. So that helped us out. So, but we were able to buy this business, which wasn't that much money because it wasn't in very, very good shape at all. To buy the business, get that space, and it was a cafe already. So it wasn't like we had a lot of build out to do. So we brought in a couple more pieces of equipment, removed some equipment, did some painting, did some cosmetic stuff, and opened. And we, from the time we signed the lease till we opened was 1 month.
Oh, wow.
And looking back, it was a little crazy, but the problem was, now all of a sudden, this leasing company didn't give us any breaks. Now I'm realizing now as we get into it and coach other cafes that you can actually really lean in on, on leases, sign that lease and help and get, several months for free. Right. Or even some of these leasing companies will actually give you money for you to build it out, or at least a partial payment or partial, capital investment towards that, because they realize that your investment that will make their space worth more. And so we're learning that there's things you can do to try to help take away from some of the pain, out the gate with a new business. So yeah, but that wasn't the case for us. So within a month we had to have our first rental payment, which was pretty significant. We're not in downtown. We're not in the most expensive space, thankfully, but yet still pretty good cost there. And so we had to get running, and so we worked like crazy.
So that was 12 years ago?
No.
10 years ago?
No, 9.5 years ago.
Really?
It'll be 10 years September. It'll be 10 years.
So you worked for your family?
We only worked. We moved here in February 2015.
Okay, so which is.
And then in September, in August, we got that space, and we opened in September of 2015. So so there's a couple months that I worked for the company.
Okay. And so what kind of like you're still pretty on board. I mean, you're still helping various cafes start, right?
Right.
Through Extend Cafes. And what kind of money does it take to start a cafe these days? Like if you want to go start a cafe, what are you looking at?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of variables. If you have the patience to wait and can find a space, that doesn't mean a lot of build out. And it has some of the existing infrastructure that you need for a cafe kind of in the genre that we want to do, which our genre of cafes, we're bringing together coffee, cuisine, I call it the 3 C's, coffee, cuisine, cafe environment, bringing food. This isn't just a coffee shop with some pastries.
Okay.
No, it's we want a family to be able to come in with their 80-year-old grandparents and the children, along with their 5 children, from 1 year old to 15, and be able to have a meal that everyone enjoys. Or whether it's that person from India or China, or, I just was chatting with a gentleman at the cafe that we know really well, that we got to know really well, from Taiwan. And he comes in literally every day to our cafe.
Oh, wow.
And he just landed a job in San Francisco, and he's just moaning because he can't eat sours in San Francisco. And so we've become really good friends with him. So yeah, so to have a menu that appeals to to a broad range of ethnicity, that's the goal. Anyhow, I'm kind of getting on a little bit of a tangent here.
But
your question. Okay, so the question is how much money. So
like what does it take? Yeah.
Yeah. So again, a lot of variables, but you could hit, if you're moving into just a space that needs built out, you could have 250,000 into it. I'm building it out just to, yeah.
And this is a rented building. This is not.
This is a rented.
Something that you own.
Yeah, yeah. Now, ideally, I mean that's on the high end. That's on the high end. So, depending on what equipment you can find in the area, can you find some used equipment? Are you a contractor yourself? Can you put most of the work into it? All these things. The goal is to pull that number down as low as you can. That's the goal. Have as much of those that initial investment as low as possible, so you can be as soon as possible turning a profit on that space. That's the goal.
So what does what is the? You're not just doing cafes because that's your business that makes the most cash. I mean.
Yeah, right. I mean, typically, the restaurant industry is notorious for having very low margins.
So what's the idea of having a cafe? Like, why have a cafe if you're going to?
Yeah, well, that was some of the story as we moved here to State College. Is we wanted to be involved in making a living where we would interact with a broad range of people often, because coming from where we were in the landscape industry, which you tend to kind of hobnob with the upper echelons of society, with that, and so. How can we make a living, which is key? I think that's really important for to when you come into a new area or whatever, is to make yourself as contextualized as possible, as much of the community as possible. And I think doing business is one of the lead ways to do that. And so making a living. So how can we do that? What can we focus on? What industry can we begin a business in? And we were toying with some of these ideas back in Altoona, as we lived in the city there. And so we started looking at some different coffee shops and cafes a little bit, and then moving here, it was like, hey, here's our opportunity to do this. And so we began to do more research, and that's how we. And then of course, so with a cafe, so you have frequent repeat customers, and that's really key to getting to know people. If you have a mechanic business, you'll maybe see people, once, twice a year. Mm-hmm. Depends what kind of how old their vehicle is. And if they come to you, it's not like they really want to come to your mechanic shop, because that's going to mean dollars.
Calling a dentist.
So the cafe world, you have high repeat customers. You have people coming to you because they want to. They're looking for a good meal. They're looking to connect with some friends. And so you can create an environment where it's good food, good coffee, it's peaceful, it's inviting, and they can come there. I like to call it a portal to heaven, or an escape. You want to create a space where people can come and kind of get away from their problems, from the stress and strain of life. And for a short time, you can create that environment that can be life-changing for them. And so, yeah, that's some of the vision there.
So wouldn't it be much easier just to run that as a 501c3, like as a nonprofit? Because
I just had this conversation just in the last week with a brother out of Oregon, through Extend Cafes, had reached out to us, and so in his mind, to have a business as a ministry, that means a nonprofit. And so we had a long conversation on that, because I have some opinions on that. And so I told him that, from the Extend Cafe's perspective, our advising, we always steer people into a for-profit. And we believe that actually there's a number of things that will make you more effective in the for-profit world than in the nonprofit world or the 501c3 world. And one of those is that the first one is sustainability. In the nonprofit world, obviously you're selling a product, so you can have an income there with a cafe and cash flow it. But what happens is nobody really owns it in the sense that it needs to be owned. I've been with a lot of nonprofits, and over the last 10 years especially, with several different nonprofits, and that's one of the big challenges is somebody needs to own it and run it.
Extreme ownership.
Because if you don't, it's dead. It's dead.
Right. Because
all of a sudden you start basing everything on groupthink and on safety. No one wants to say the buck stops here. If it dies, it's my fault. If it lives, we're going to pass out the praises. But that ownership. And so with a for-profit model, you have an owner, or maybe two owners. That's fine. But you have somebody that says, okay, we're going to make this thing is going to live or die with depending how we run this. And so you put a lot of work into it. Running a business, as you know, is hard work, and you take risk. It feels like you're always taking risk in business, but that's some of the fun of it. That's some of the challenge of it. That's some of the opportunities when you take those risks. And of course, you got to take calculated risks. And sometimes you realize you made a dumb move and you shouldn't have done that. And you learn and you grow and you keep on moving. But sustainability really here is about ownership. It's being owned. It's not a board. It is you owning it, which at the same time, we're a huge advocate with Extend Cafes too of seeing there being not just some dictator at the front, but if you want a healthy business, if you want a business that smells like heaven, if you want a place where it's where people come, your guests come there and it's escape, your workers have to first be the ones who experience that. Because if your team is dysfunctional and you have a dictator and you have bad culture and the manager is not a nice human, you attract not nice humans. I mean, it quickly becomes very, very broken, very toxic. And so having the idea of a polycentric leadership, I think, is really important, where you have the owner, the manager, and one or two others that are part of a core team, we call it, that are helping lead the initiative. So obviously the owner is going to make some calls, but typically most of the decision and leadership actually comes out of several people leading the initiative. And so so helping people kind of think through some of these things are really important.
So how do cafes play into church planting? Like, is that a useful vehicle?
Well, I think that it can be. Actually, I'm certain that it can be, and that was one of the pains that we had. Moving to State College was like, okay, so one of our pains is we want to see kingdom communities in urban settings, and how is that going to happen? And so many times, in the kind of the Anabaptist world, the idea is, I was just reading a description of a person who spoke somewhere, and he said he was part of a inner city mission church. And when you kind of use that terminology, mission church, that means most likely that there was money coming in. So it's kind of this missionary field, supported missionary idea.
Okay.
And so moving here, one of our quote pains, if you will, was like, let's have something, let's figure out how to do church in a way that you're not having to have money come in from other places. You can do church planting, do church work, and be supported. And support yourself, be self-supporting.
Right. Yeah.
And then also too, how can you have a business where you interface with people regularly and you can build trust with people? Because, 1 Peter 3:15 says, when people ask of you, of the hope that's within us. So for someone to ask you a question, that takes time and relationship. And so I think that a cafe is one of those businesses. There's others too, But it's one of those businesses that can really create that opportunity, can make yourself accessible to your community, where people come in often, and pretty soon they're your friend. And then you'll find yourself in these conversations and these questions being asked that just happen one day. And it's like, how did my friend Daniel from Taiwan become a really good friend who's going to join us for church on Sunday? I don't know. It happened. And all of a sudden Daniel's showing up, yeah.
So how do you staff a cafe like so one of the biggest problems with the restaurant industry is, like you said, toxic environments.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you keep from getting, where do you find a big enough pool to not have a toxic environment? Or like is it certain people, or is it just the culture? I know you run the culture another way, or like how are you not getting, or how are you keeping it from becoming toxic?
Yeah. So I would say there's two pillars that are really important to have in place. So the owner needs to be very involved in helping develop this. Once these are developed, then the owner maybe doesn't have to be as involved daily. But those two is leadership and culture. So you need to have a really good manager, and maybe even assistant, but at least one really good manager who's aligned with your vision and is willing to kind of walk that out every day, just in patient, kind ways. Steady, patient pressure is a term that one guy who owned numerous restaurants in his book calls. And it just sounds like discipleship to me. Steady, patient pressure. And that's how. So creating that leadership that is helping people move in that healthy direction of what you define as the culture you want in your cafe or the environment, and then also your culture too, which is like, this is how we do things here. And so when you have most of your team saying, here we have considerate communication, or here we have sacrificial service. Our three guiding principles for our team at Sowers is those two: considerate communication, sacrificial service, and then the third one is inspiring initiation. And we hire on that. That's very much upfront in our hiring process. This is who we are. And then we'll also fire on that too. Like, if you continue to trend away from these things, that would mean you cannot be part of Sowers, because this is who we are. And we expect you to come and not only accept these, but also but help build it, help build that kind of a culture there. And so I would say those two are really important. But hiring is a huge thing that with Extend Cafes, we are trying to develop kind of some principles and ways of going about it, because I don't feel like we necessarily have, we've thought a lot about it, but we haven't put very many processes in place for going into the future and really building on that. But it's definitely, when you create a place where there's a good culture, you then attract people that want to be part of that. So we recently had a gentleman start for us. He's not a Christian. He's from a different country, but he wants to grow himself, and also kind of learn kind of English and a little better and in this period of his life. And so he came to Sowers saying, "Can I work there? Because I want to grow. I see that you guys have a lot of teamwork, and I think that I could use that." And so he's working for us, and he's not a Christian, but it's amazing. Like, what he's contributing to our culture is really substantial. And so trying to, one of the goals is to, first of all, be that place. And then vet people, so that you're hiring people that help build that culture. And so it's not really rocket science. We've been blessed with many, many good team members over the years. And, but it's definitely, if you want to have a good culture, you got to be intentional about it.
So you're also doing some coffee roasting. That's what we are right now. in the coffee roasting facility. Why did you decide to start roasting coffee? Like, what's...
Yeah. Well, that was kind of from the beginning. From the beginning, we kind of had two visions with sowers, maybe three.
Maybe four.
One vision was to be a kingdom embassy in downtown, right? To bring a piece of the home turf to foreign soil was kind of vernacular. And then the second one, the second vision, what was that one going to be? I'm forgetting right now.
Not roast coffee.
That was definitely one. Oh, the second one was actually, we had actually one of the visions was starting Sowers was to try to create a place that could be duplicated.
Okay.
Because if we are going to see churches being sustainable in urban settings, you need to have businesses. For almost every angle of a healthy church, you need a business, whether it's advancement of the kingdom or whether it's just, supporting yourself and your families.
You also need diversity in business, which, if everybody's in the construction industry and the construction industry goes south, then your church doesn't have very much resilience.
Yeah. And so we had this vision of what if we could actually create something that could be duplicated. And it was rather audacious. And looking back now, I see how audacious it was, or maybe naive, because the first couple of years were really hard with sowers, just kind of as we learned the whole process, and there was some hard years there. And then the third one was to be selling coffee and cuisine that was local if possible and sourced well. And coffee gives you this opportunity to reach into the world and to source, it's a product that comes from all around the world. The coffee belt, which is kind of the 1040 window actually, which, so what if, this whole coffee roasting thing could actually create opportunities to get into other parts of the world and see churches get planted, and I don't know, and so that was kind of some of the vision there at the beginning. And then we didn't start roasting coffee until probably 3 years ago. We started to kind of behind the scenes start roasting with a small drum roaster for our cafe and start kind of learning all the ropes. And 6 years ago, I started interacting with a man from Burundi, which is East Africa, right south of Ethiopia, which that's where all the coffee comes out of Africa. There's a lot of it in that area. Ethiopian is very known as top quality coffee. And he was telling me about all the exploitation that he saw happening in Burundi. He said, he actually said he would not buy coffee anywhere else here in the West except at Sowers, because he said he knows that we're sourcing it well. I was like, well, I hope. Because at that point we were just buying from a roaster 45 minutes away, which, he was definitely pretty aware of where his coffee was coming from. And so I was confident it was being sourced well. But what my friend Arnaud told me, my Burundian friend, he said there is so much hocus pocus in the coffee industry, you cannot believe what you read. Because as they say, coffee goes through 100 hands from crop to cup. It's went through 100 hands. And I was just in Southeast Asia, in Thailand, and in the country of Laos and Indonesia, and was on coffee farms and just seeing all the people harvesting it, and then you're drying it, and then you're just tons of work. The coffee just flows through a lot of hands. And so, which means a huge opportunity, unfortunately, for people to exploit those in that chain, and that's happening all the time by a lot of the big companies. You just cannot believe, Arnaud said, what you read, and I think there's some truth there. I have enough. My trust in humanity isn't that low to totally not buy coffee anywhere else, except at some place where I know it's coming from, but. That's definitely happening. And so he said he would love to help us get into his country, which is the poorest country in the world, and source coffee out of there. And so 3 years ago, one of our workers and my friend Joe from Coronation Cafe went over and spent some time in Burundi, got on the farms, got to see this whole process. And then recently we got to source a whole load out of there, a container load, working with Java Taza out of Lancaster, who's a Mennonite roaster. We become good friends with us. And so we source all of our Central and South American coffee from them, the green beans from them, because we know they're buying it well. And then working together with this Burundian coffee, there's no way I can take 16 ton of coffee in a year, but they can. They go through numerous containers of coffee. And so we're now able to. This is Brunding right here, actually.
Yeah, well.
This comes right out of the hills of Brundy, and so we can know that it's being sourced well, and so it's just exciting to be able to kind of work with people around the world. Which that's where our name for our coffee roasting is called Parakia, coffee and tea, and Parakia is a Greek word that captures kind of the ancient idea of an economic community working together. So it's a communal idea of working together, not only on a Sunday morning, but kind of your life. It's a community of people who are sojourners, in a foreign place, walking together, helping each other.
So is this a word out of the Bible, or is this a...
It's used twice, yeah. It's used, one of the most obvious places is in 1 Peter 3, where it talks about us being sojourners and pilgrims here.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the Greek word for that would be...
Parakia.
Okay.
Yeah.
Parakia.
Yeah, no, it's a tough word, and I wasn't sure it was going to stick. We kind of had it in our back pocket for a year or two and kept using it, and finally it stuck. And so here we are, whether we like it or not. So that, if we can, use some of the connections that we're making, through Sowers, which is Penn State has, 80 to 90 different countries any given year coming into our cafe, and it can be a real tangible way to work with somebody and help cut out the middlemen and go right to the farmer, work right with the people on the ground there, and make sure that they're getting paid their fair dues. It's just a really neat opportunity.
Yeah. So you're roasting coffee, you're running a cafe, you're running a cafe network, you're running Strength to Strength or with Glenn. Is there anything else you're doing that I don't know about?
Sounds like that sounds good enough.
Are you getting ready?
Making me tired.
Are you getting ready to do anything else that I ought to know about?
I'll tell you after it happens.
Okay. But as we think about the way churches and coffee roasting and cafes and all this stuff, like how it intertwines. Like obviously you can roast coffee without having a church. You can have a cafe without having a church.
Right.
But some of that stuff comes together to help make networks and connections that work outside that are greater than the sum of their parts. Mm-hmm. But what are your thoughts? I mean, you're trying to extend or network cafes. Like State College is one of a very small, I guess unaffiliated is probably the correct way to call it. But how do we create a network, like a bigger network of unaffiliated churches? Like there's a lot of small unaffiliated churches. Mm-hmm. Like, how do we bring these churches together?
An affiliation of the unaffiliated.
Yeah.
He asked a good question because, we kind of joke about it, but we're not.
Right.
We're not interested in just being independent. We had this conversation over in Netherlands with that couple that's there who they're church builders. They will be, Lord willing, he will be leading a church and at the forefront, I believe, of the kingdom church movement in that part of the world. I really believe that. And, and of course they've been, for a number of years, he and his wife were in these smaller house churches, just trying to find a biblical church. And they were always very independent minded. They kind of had this idea that we are the remnant, we have the corner on truth. And that led them into a really, really, really bad place. And so he's not interested in being, another independent Anabaptist church. And amen, that's right. The idea of interdependence, I think, is really a fruit of Christianity, whether in the local church or in the broader church. Just as a person needs to be in a community, a sacred community, so churches should be in a community of churches. And that can look a number of different ways. It might look like, a denomination that I came out of, or it could look like a network where you're trying to be intentional and where there's some, where there's interaction among the churches, hopefully in a very relational way. I think that's key. So maybe you ask the question is, how can we see this happen, right?
Right.
So I think it needs to happen geographically, where there is a relationships, or do you want to turn it into some kind of, structured, where you're like a safe critique would be a Catholic church, setting where you have all these very official, structures. You want to turn it into that, or do you want to have more of the relational component, which I think when you look at the New Testament church, these churches and cities work together,
right,
very closely, and so I think relational, being geographically close, so there can be a good bit of interaction. A relational component should be one of a really important component.
I recently saw somebody wrote that all unaffiliated independent churches are Baptist. They don't know it; they just are. Mm-hmm. Well, we obviously aren't, but I say we obviously aren't. I don't think we are.
Right.
But I think he had a point, because a lot of independent, unaffiliated churches could be Baptists with different practices. Mm-hmm. Like they're even a lot of independent Anabaptist churches could almost qualify for Baptist. I mean, there's a very, very blurry line between a fundamentalist Baptist church and a Anabaptist church that is a little more God and country. Like the line is very, very blurry.
Right.
Is there ever room for like a theological distinction in churches, like in networking? Like, is there a need for that, or room for that, or how does that? We don't want to have everybody, like you said, you use Catholics for instance, like they need to adhere to a fairly narrow theology to be Catholic. Mm-hmm. Is that a legitimate way to build a church network, or does there need to be?
Yeah, so I think that maybe in the denominational sense, or Catholicism, if you want, like, you're using kind of a safe example, yeah. It's often there's a good bit of command and control, where I think I would see a biblical component to a network of churches being engaged and aligned. So, and I think that is, I think a large part of that engaging and aligning is doctrinal, is on doctrine, because if we have, I'm not sure exactly what your question was there, but if we're not theologically aligned, there's obviously some maybe, secondary or third area that we maybe are, it's up to the conscience, and there's obviously a theological triage, where there's some where there is main things that are very important, and then there's second things that would probably need to be defined. But I do think, though, that I do think that a really clear grasp of the kingdom and what that means to be ambassadors of the kingdom, which really is a Sermon on the Mount kind of way of life. Maybe viewing that as our constitution, it does help. We're seeing that with some of the church we're interacting with, does bring a very much of a relational we be brothers in Christ component, where some of their practices are different, and that's okay. What you find in a lot of denominations is command and control, especially on practices where we have to look the same to be part of the same denomination.
This is probably more in conservative Mennonite churches.
Sure. But I think that, so for example, let's just do a little thought experiment that we would help see a church started or give oversight, quote, to a church in the Netherlands. Like, we're not going to expect them to have some of our same maybe American Anabaptist practices there in the Netherlands for the Dutch people as for us. We'll be okay with some differences there, but on the things of doctrine, we will be very aligned. So I think engagement and alignment around the things that matter is kind of core to. What do you think?
Is that not what? Is that not what just almost all churches have always said? Is that we're unified? Take a church that has black hats, and they'll say, well, we can't fellowship with you because you don't wear a black hat.
Mm-hmm.
We can't fellowship with you because that you don't. And this is particularly in Mennonites. Now you get into the other denominations, they're going to say, well, we can't fellowship with you because you believe that in some other theological point.
It becomes quickly, in that setting, more of a doctrinal.
Right, because the Mennonites, we generally don't talk much about the doctrinals. I mean, we have a kind of a overarching agreement on what the doctrinal things are, and we tend to divide on practice.
And they've been kind of set, more of the other time is set and forget,
Yeah, right.
This is kind of how we've done it, the Garden City Confession of Faith or whatever, this is how we do it. And then, but there oftentimes maybe more the differences then or divisions potentially happen kind of on some of those pragmatic areas.
But if we're trying to build a church network and we're not the same in practice, we are looking at a little bit of diversity in practice, how much diversity can we have in doctrine or theology and still fellowship? Or still have robust fellowship? Sure.
Yeah, and so I think the matter of theological, what some people have called theological triage, so if there's an accident and an ambulance pulls up and the paramedics and the EMTs jump out, there's a couple of vehicles, there's just a 30-car pileup here on Interstate 80, they're not looking at the people sitting over the bank. They might be hurt, but they walked there. Okay, great. We're not going to spend any time. They're spending time with the people that are hurt. So you come into a scene and you do triage.
Hurt, yeah.
That person's going to live. You let him go.
Okay.
Here's the things that matter. And so I believe that we need to sharpen our pencils. We need to strengthen some muscles that probably have atrophied on what is the heart of the kingdom. What are the doctrines that matter? What are the first things? And what are the second things? And and that can sound, it sounds kind of complicated, but I'm not sure how else we should do that.
So if you're looking,
and so then having a unified lens, maybe I'm kind of jumping ahead of you, probably we're heading here. So we need to develop a unified lens of looking at Scripture,
right? Because
there's 100 ways to look at it.
So how do we develop a unified lens?
Yeah, and I think that's $1 million question. What is that unified lens? And I would like to suggest that it's, the crisp understanding of the kingdom, the current kingdom of God, kingdom Christianity, that we are part of a kingdom, Jesus is our king, and we have these laws, is a beginning phase. Like seeing Jesus, as who he is. He is the ultimate revelation of God in Scripture, and the Bible is a story that leads to Jesus. And I think that can bring I've seen it bring some incredible unity across a lot of diversity, is this idea that we are citizens of the same nation and Jesus is our king, and that helps break down barriers of ethnicity, denomination, or whatever. And it's beautiful. And not saying that some barriers of ethnicity and some barriers of denomination are bad necessarily. I think we got really weird and high on some of that stuff.
Yeah.
but the kingdom of God helps lower those things down, those differences, and we be brothers. And that was part of the beauty of moving here to State College and being part of a church that isn't so defined by denomination. Is you get to interact with people who you've never done before, because it just comes with the territory. And some of that can, there's not saying it's all, it's all beautiful, but it does. I believe it's more biblical.
So interacting with various people that would kind of believe in a kingdom view, it gets pretty tricky when you get into people that are otherwise completely aligned or almost completely aligned with us, but then they would be, I guess it's premillennials that believe that we're before the.
So that's dispensational.
Okay.
Premillennials,
Okay.
dispensational
Okay.
premillennials. So, there has always been, quote, premillennials, people who
Yeah.
believe that
Right.
in the 1,000-year reign in the future, pre that millennium, there's a historic premillennial.
That makes us
but-
pre-kingdom.
Well, no, and see, this is the difference.
Okay.
And then you have, in just the last 300 years, you have a Darby, really pushing this idea along with a lot of other guys. Not only him, but this whole big movement started, which there's another whole story for another day. And I don't claim to even know a lot of it, but no, just a little enough of it to not know I don't want it. But it's the it's the dispensational idea. So they would believe in dispensations. They would believe that God is kind of working on two fronts. With the church, which was kind of Plan B because Israel didn't take Jesus as their king, and then God's working also with a nation, with the actual nation of Israel. So what was your question there?
Well, that was my question was, there are people like, well, I won't name any names, but there are some pretty big name people that
Right.
that really preach the kingdom, but it's not like a lot of similarities to the way I believe the kingdom, but a lot of ways that I just wouldn't believe are the same. And it's hard to define. Like, kingdom is such a difficult definition.
Right.
So we can take these guys that are pretty far out there that are preaching kingdom, but yet they either have a very, very limited understanding, or they have, like, it seems like at some level, a completely different understanding of, they say Jesus is king, but then they're
off the
they may not actually
very
be
not
right.
often nationalistic.
Right.
Their king is actually Trump. But yeah.
or it doesn't even have to be Trump, but
Right.
it can, like. So my question there is, like, how do we like, is kingdom good enough, like a good enough alignment for who we want to fellowship with, or is that just kind of a very high level idea to kind of, if you're willing to embrace that idea, then we can talk to you.
I think it was definitely one of the foundations for sure, is believing in the current kingdom of God, but there is consequences with that belief, and a person who understands Jesus as king and understands what he did in inaugurating the new covenant, this new kingdom, this new humanity that is not defined by geopolitical boundaries. If the person, as he develops and understands this amazing spiritual reality, will come to understand that it's the Israel of God that are his people, that is a church, and it's not some nation state in the Middle East.
Right.
And so I think that's one of the beauties of a crisp kingdom understanding, is that it does bring unity in these areas. And but however, how do we interface though with people who do lean that way? I think there's that's an appropriate question to talk about. Could we have them? Would we be okay with them at our own communion table? Would we be okay with them in our own network? That's a big question that
That's kind of my question. Is like networking is something that I've really thought a lot about. Like, I feel like independent churches are they're either already dead or getting ready to be.
right.
Like
Right.
independence is just terrible. Like it's a terrible idea for a church. Like
Right. Yeah, and so I think there needs to be. We have to be okay with diversity, but the question is, what are the first things?
right, because I care also a lot about diversity, but at the same time, as I'm looking at both of these, I don't want to be independent, but I do want to allow diversity. Where's the balance? Like, how do we find some sort of balance that works that allows diversity, doesn't create independence? Like, what kind of platform can we use to? I mean, kingdom is one of those filters. I think the historic faith is another one of those filters that can actually bring us together.
Okay. And when you say the historic faith, could you just unpack that a little bit?
So I would see the historic faith as the New Testament and the first 200 years of Christianity. Kind of and understanding that the first 200 years of Christianity will help us interpret some of the things that aren't said, or some of the actions that they in the New Testament. Just for instance, something as simple as selling all things and having all things in common, and getting and meeting on the first day of the week.
So are you just pause for a second there, back up a little bit. Are you saying that they had all things in common?
Well, if you read the first 200 years of Christianity, it helps kind of shed a little bit different light on what's happening in Acts.
Sure. Okay. So it's a commentary. Maybe we could call it as a commentary, right?
Yeah.
To what does that mean?
Right. I mean, they probably did. I mean, it does seem like they did tell their things and have them in common. But in the first 200 years, we're not seeing all churches doing that, but they are living with an open hand toward each other.
Right.
Kind of like the feet washing thing, where maybe they're not literally washing feet, but they are literally serving each other.
Right.
And where they're maybe not literally selling everything and having all things in common, but definitely having all things in common. Like, what's mine is yours, what's yours is mine.
Yeah.
To a strong degree. It's not like a lot of independence. So I think the historic faith gives us a foundation or a lens, another lens.
Right.
So you take the kingdom as kind of a broad lens. The historic faith narrows that a little bit more, so we can kind of starting to see a little bit clearer who is maybe. I don't know if in our camp is the right word. We don't want to create a bunch of different camps, but who we can comfortably align with.
Yeah, no, I would agree with you. Yeah, and I think that, and just kind of going through this Sacred Root series on Strength to Strength, too, has been even more confirming of that. Like that the historic faith is something that we need to continue to mine out and to understand what was going on there, and honor what those people were doing. Try to, it can be easy to be judgmental or just totally dismissive of that. And that's what I find. Even what's interesting, interact with ancient faith people, they're pretty dismissive of those first couple hundred years. It's like from Augustine on, is kind of how what we respect. But yeah, because that first couple hundred years the church there looked so different than what the church does, what the majority of the church does today.
Right. And it vastly changed by 400 or 500 years.
That's right.
It was becoming a lot more like what the Catholic Orthodox Church looks like today.
Right.
Yeah. But I mean, it wasn't completely gone to that, but it was definitely way more of that. But no, it's just that it's so hard. I mean, especially if we're part of an independent church, that or unaffiliated church, it's so hard to be able to know where to draw lines. If you should draw lines, I mean, that's one thing that I really love here too. Is one thing that we here at State College have tried hard to do is respect everyone, even though we don't agree, even if we don't agree with them, and not be disrespectful or dismissive of people that are trying, especially that fit under the kingdom umbrella. But even outside of that, like we've tried hard to not be dismissive of them. But at some point, where do you tell your children? I mean, how will your children know where the lines are? I hear this question a lot. Like, well, if everybody's a Christian, we're all going to heaven. Why are you working so hard?
Yeah. And I think that's where we need to be real with people who are outside of the Sermon on the Mount Christianity are in a very scary place. And so what I've seen happen with some Anabaptist churches, and I've lived long enough now to kind of see some, different some of the results of certain views and certain worldviews and certain ways of kind of looking at Christianity, is when people have this idea that we're Mennonites or we're Anabaptists just because we're Anabaptists. It's kind of our culture. It's awesome. We're just going to propagate it. But this Protestant over here, hey, he's a fine Christian. Why not let him speak in our church occasionally or whatever? And we're not in any way confronting them or engaging them around. I don't think we necessarily want to confront, but
Right.
being willing to engage them on the things where they are, the areas where they're not being obedient to Scripture. And I think I do believe that there's a certain there's a certain spiritual pride or Christianese that I think we can so quickly fall in of the Pharisees, where it's we're willing to kind of hobnob with a lot of other people, but yet people who aren't Christians, we can look down on them and try to distance ourselves from the quote world. But what would Jesus do? What did he do Passover week? He went into the temple and flipped over the money changers' tables and faced those Pharisees. And when he's doing that, all he is doing is just hyperlinking back into the Old Testament to the prophets who said that, who prophesied of someone who was to come, who was going to bring judgment on these unrighteous, hypocritical people. And so, yeah, so sometimes I do believe that as people like in the moderate Anabaptist world, in the conservative Anabaptist world, like the conservatives,
Like conservative in practice.
yeah, in practice,
Yeah.
they have some pretty serious, pretty serious lines there.
Yeah, right.
But you move in the moderate conservative world, there's a good bit of interaction with other Protestant groups or groups that are going Protestant, and it just seems like there isn't much of a concern there. And I think that's actually how we can lose our children is if we're not helping ourselves, our churches, our families see that there is a departing from truth there, and we cannot do communion with them.
So what's your dividing line for? I mean, like what is your personal? I'm not going to have communion with these people. Like, where are you going to say?
Well, I really appreciate where we are as a congregation, and I know that a number of the congregations that we interact with, where it's if you are somebody who is not running from a church, problems. If you show up on a Sunday and you're not excommunicated, you're not running from a church, problem. We've even called up their elders and said, hey, can this brother commune with us? having that respect for other churches and their assessment of a person. Are they a part of a church that is embracing of the Sermon on the Mount and living out the doctrines of the New Testament? Yes, they are. Well, then you're welcome to join us for communion. Communion is actually something that should be unifying, and so if you show up, at our service, we have our communion before the service, but show up in our community, and you have your testimony is at peace with God and your fellow men from where you're from, and you're part of a church that's striving to, or yourself, a Sermon on the Mount type Christianity, living according to the doctrines of the New Testament, living a life, a life that shows that, you'll be welcome to join. So I'm kind of thinking of that visitor that shows up, if you will. But I think maybe you're thinking maybe potentially broader, like in a network of churches. And I do think that communion, we really need to apply what we see as the if maybe offense, if you will, or the guarding the table as one way to determine, can I fellowship with this congregation? Like, would we do communion together? I think really that's what communion is all about.
So
is keeping the purity of the church.
No adulterers, no murderers. I mean, that's kind of that's the church discipline for the.
Well, I think it's a life that is being lived. It's not so much obviously doctrine doesn't matter, but are they living that life that is according to the way of Jesus, according to the Sermon on the Mount, right?
Yeah, I mean that's useful for who to include, but maybe not quite as maybe more difficult to define for who to exclude. Like if you're looking at exclusion versus inclusion, sure, if you're looking to include someone, it's pretty easy to see if they are, if we think that they're living a kingdom-focused, kingdom-centered life that is in alignment with the historic faith, and that they're having a love-faith relationship with Jesus Christ. I mean, that on the inclusive side, that's not hard to see. But then when you get to the exclusion, it's kind of, the line gets so fuzzy. It's like, well, maybe they are, maybe they're not.
Sure.
And as we think about groups, especially, it gets much more difficult because I tend to pretty easily look at someone who is a practicing Anabaptist and say, hey, they're probably good. But I'm not sure where my duty is to look at someone. I mean, like, I really wrestled with this myself. Like, where would I draw the line in communion? Like, would I draw the line? Obviously, I'm not going to intentionally commune with someone who's a fornicator or a murderer. But those aren't the only things to. I mean,
right.
Those are not the only criteria.
Right.
And as you're looking at church networking, it needs to be people that we can really closely fellowship with. People that I'm happy to see my children become my children's marriage partners, and that I'm happy to have join us to speak in our church and
join us for communion.
And join us for communion.
Yeah.
And things like that like, they don't have to believe exactly like us. They don't have to do exactly like us. I mean, I see people that, some people that wear suspenders, and that's fine. If they want to join us for communion, that won't exclude them.
Right.
But it is tricky to know, how much of a difference am I comfortable with, and am I like it's so much easier to be black and white.
Right.
But I think that black and white is.
Yeah. No, that's. I believe there needs to be there's nuance here. There's gray areas, and a spiritual conversation with spiritual leadership needs to work through these things. There's no way you can set it and forget it. That's not the way of the kingdom. Setting and forgetting. You need to be, you're always grappling with principle, with direction. Is this person, he might be, or this church might be, in a particular denomination or faith tradition, but what direction are they heading? What is their direction? I think is a important conversation.
So how do you keep any stability? If you're looking at, if you have a black and white system, you set it and forget it. Most of our traditional Anabaptist churches have not looked at their church standards in the last 20 years, other than to enforce them. Like, they're not looking at them to change them. It's they why change something that's done right? And I'm not saying that these church standards are wrong. I'm just saying that is generally kind of the way they're looked at. And it gives a lot of stability. Mostly you can say, hey, this is the way we believe. This is what we've done for the last 20 years. Why would we change it? So there's not any energy wasted or spent thinking about why do we have a standard about a certain kind of clothing. We just don't think about that. As you move to a more of a, what are the principles that God has laid out in the Bible, and what are the principles that the church understood in the first several hundred years behind dress, and then try to apply that, it's just way more complicated. And how do doesn't that destabilize young people?
So I think there is beauty, there is stability in unity. When there is true unity around a topic, or around some of the culture, some of the ways that you do things, and however, I do think that spiritual leadership, a spiritual church, quickly gets skeptical of black and white, of a booklet of standards. There's just, that's, you're heading in, you're creating a weight that is very heavy for anyone to carry. And that is quickly becomes a law and takes you away from the heart of Christianity, which is a life where you are striving to live according to God and His ways and His kingdom, and you begin to exclude people because of this is kind of who we are. So there's actually an exclusion that can happen, and it can become just out of a heart of. Also, I think fear often is driving that. A lot of fear. And we know that God hasn't given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. And so I believe there can be, a certain sense of kind of, this is how we do things here. But when we begin to just stack on more and more and more, this is how we do it here. You start getting into so many nuanced things that you quickly lose the principle. And we know that there's places in the New Testament we could go to that would point out some of these things. It becomes the laws of men rather than the law of God. And so I do think that every every congregation kind of takes on its own, maybe some of its own personality in some of these areas and some things that are facing. And every generation, you kind of face different fights. And so we do our children a disfavor when you create this kind of set it and forget it. You lose your muscles waste. They atrophy. You don't have that that strength to engage around biblical principle. Here the principles are, and we're called to live like this. This is what God says. This is what the Bible says. This is the way we should do it. Now, at the same time, I think there's traditions that are rich and can be a blessing, and we don't want to be just, every generation recreating anew. Like that would be hard too. I think there is a sense of, this is kind of how we've done it. This is, this is how we do it for today. I think there's actually a respect. Somebody has said traditionalism is a dead faith of the living. Tradition is a living faith of the dead. And I kind of like that. And there is biblical tradition that we should respect and honor. And I think that, and just, right now, I was just spending with this week, with Passover week. I think it's to look back and look way back, the children coming out of Egypt, what all happened there and how God provided for them. Then you have this Passover meal. Then you have Jesus, and becoming the perfect Lamb of God, and instituting the Lord's Supper. It's just, it's a kind of a remaking, of the Passover meal for the new covenant. These are all traditions. And that's why I think it's so beautiful to tie ourselves into tradition. So I think the question is, and every person, every church needs to kind of grapple with these things of, is this of the Spirit? Is this a tradition that we should honor? Or is it just traditionalism? Just some dead faith? And so I think every church, as they work out the application to principle, they do it with caution, and maybe even with an expiration date on it. Saying that, this is how we do it now, but I'm not saying that we need to do it 10 years from now. There's a sense of like a question.
So how does that play into starting new churches?
Mm-hmm.
As you start a new church, everybody, almost everybody sees things in a different nuance.
Right.
And you start a new church. How do you ensure that the new church is, it doesn't have to look like the old church, but
right.
How do you ensure that it has, that it is a faithful?
It's rooted.
Yeah.
Won't be driven around by every wind of doctrine that comes along.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, so I think it comes back to, that theological triage, right? What are the first things here, and orienting yourselves around that, and a church that's, quote, giving oversight, which I think that is important, and we've had the privilege of doing that, is going to be wise in how they, it's not going to be, you can either you be a carbon copy of us, or you can allow them, just like a young couple that gets married, to kind of figure out their home and what it all looks like. And then that sense of, the course is obviously principles. There's these important principles, but it might evolve and look different, in some ways than our congregation. That's okay. So I think there's an idea again here of engaging and aligning. Like, we just tend to be people who want to either do that, set and forget, or command and
Right.
control, rather than engaging and aligning. I think is something that is so hard to do, and do it well, where you're not just alienating people and not. But yeah, somehow we need to lean into those things, which, again, that relational component is so important. So I think that within the church, a church that's striving to have relationships and be relational is how we talk about our problems. We're together often, and our church is together. We grapple with these things together as brothers, and sometimes in full church meetings. And then the same way with the churches that are in our network, where we're, there's that relational component that is happening, where we're working together. I believe is key, to a biblical network. And respect for the local church too. I think we've seen too much of where the local church and what it should be doing is taken away by some type of structure that's over it, or something like that.
typically in a mission board.
Well, there we go. I mean, that
or
would be a safe example,
a safe example that everybody already knows about.
right? Which is dead in the water.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what else should we talk about?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Maybe we should do another one in the future.
This will have to be one of a series.
Yeah. Well, and maybe we should talk about some point. Is your vision for seeing more churches get planted? Is there ways that you're dreaming about? What should it look like? And maybe even also with somewhat of the awareness being raised that men have been cut out in a way. Like there's been some kind of with the West and the huge growth of feminism, how that has impacted the church, and how do we make sure that we are staying on track with a Christ-like masculinity? What should that look like? How do we challenge young generation? And also, I think too, even around this whole church planting idea, is taking away some of the mystery around it. I think I've heard you talk about that already. Mystery,
Right, yeah.
Maybe some of the sophistication. I think that churches have either they get analysis paralysis, don't do it at all. They just get whatever. They get stagnated, stalemated. It's not happening.
Both.
Or it's done in such a loosey-goosey way and with maybe the more independent mindset, and it dies. But how can, so kind of masculinity maybe and church planting, what should it look like? And how do we see more people stepping into that and not thinking that it has to be some kind of specially trained or specially gifted person or some kind of special team that's been vetted, extensively and whatever. I would love to hear some of your thoughts on that.
Well, I think there's it should be a little bit like warriors, where you have men that are trained, but not trained. They're trained for a general mission, and then then they're sent out on specific missions. Versus, sometimes they're trained for specific missions, but normally in the armed forces, men are trained to be good at a lot of things, and then they're sent out as they're trained. I mean, they're sent out. They can be sent anywhere. Where if you train somebody specifically for a certain environment, then they're not. You can't. If you train somebody for a desert, then you can't send them to the jungle nearly as easily. Where I think that's some, like, with church planting, if we can train more men in the general, to be good at the general, I guess some of the things I think about is the historic faith. Like, can we train young men why it's important to care about the historic faith, why it is important to care about the kingdom? Like, why? Like, I love to see young men that are waking up to those ideas and coming in close, because if they can be trained in that, then they can be sent out as evangelists. But if they have been trained in this idea that, all we got to do is get people to pray the sinner's prayer, then they're almost useless evangelists. I mean, actually, almost a negative, like almost worse than not having an evangelist.
Right.
But then the other side of that is then people get really specific and they're like, well, we have to train you exactly how to do evangelism. No, you don't. You don't have to train people exactly how to do evangelism. You have to train, men need to be trained on how to think about the kingdom, how to think about the church. And when you understand the kingdom and the church and how this works together, then you are an evangelist.
Mm-hmm. Amen.
Like that becomes you.
Right.
And you don't.
It doesn't need to be any more high tech than that.
It doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be this big. Let's get everybody trained in these special areas.
Right. I'm seeing there's a whole movement kind of within a certain segment of the Anabaptist world on the DMM, discipleship, DMM, discipleship movement mission, where they're really focusing on how to catalyze a movement.
Okay.
And they're
Sounds dangerous.
and so they're it's being taught by Protestants, so there's a whole world where, and this all started in foreign work, in international work, where supposedly there's 1 year if you get a movement going, and then it's all about scaling it, right?
Yeah.
So you teach people some of these kind of fundamentals, and then they take it and go teach the next person in all these little small groups, and but it's just lacking so much. But yet it's very formulaic at the end of the day.
Yeah.
It's very focused on this kind of quick moving thing. I just don't see that happening. I believe that as we look at the historic faith at the early church, there was very much of this idea of patience,
Right.
a patient ferment, as Alan Kreider has said, that they did, and it wasn't. They didn't even write about evangelism. Right. Yeah, they didn't write about evangelism. And so what I hear you saying is we need to focus on some of those really foundational concepts, the fundamentals, if you will.
Don't use that word.
That's hilarious. But on those foundational concepts that are biblical, biblical, and also according to the historic faith, that can empower people to be the hands and feet of Jesus in our day. And it's not some kind of formula, and it's not like 7 points necessarily.
Right. But it is. I mean, if you kind of step back, it is a formula. It's just a radically different formula.
Yeah.
It's a the formula. I mean, and the reason I think as I look around, the people that matter. I should say the people that matter. The people that have the most influence in the direction of a church should be men.
Right.
And too many times it's not. Too many times men are busy in business, and they're like any deep spiritual thing, you're going to see the women more interested. Because women are, in some way, are wired more spiritual. And men have kind of lost interest because men are interested in the discipline and conquering and those things that the church has kind of just walked away from, and it's all just become this emotional spiritual experience. And that's like, men have some interest in that, but it's not their primary interest. The emotional side is not their primary interest. Where with it, especially in non-Anabaptist churches where this is happening, but it's filtering into the Anabaptist churches, to where I've just seen more and more women that are I shouldn't say running churches, but more and more of the churches are run by spiritual women that are probably there because men weren't stepping up to the plate, but it shouldn't be that way.
Mm-hmm.
So my dream is to see the men re-inspired and return to leadership roles, and I think that would move us back into a conquering church instead of a defensive church.
Very interesting. I think that's worth looking into and pursuing.
But it's not going to happen overnight.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, obviously. Well, maybe we should try this again sometime.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, enjoyed it. Yeah. Lesson, brother.
Same.